Somewhere in the Jordan Valley, under a low hill called Tel Sultan, there is a tower, not the ruins of one, not the foundation stones of one, an actual tower still standing to nearly 9 meters, built from fieldstone without mortar, without metal tools, without any blueprint we have ever found. It was constructed roughly 11,000 years ago, before the first Egyptian pharaoh, before the wheel, before any writing system scratched its earliest symbols into wet clay, before anyone, as far as we know, had ever done anything quite like it before. That's the puzzle that sits at the center of this story. Not a city, not a king, not a civilization in any sense we usually reach for when we use that word. Just a tower, a massive circular wall, and the bones of hundreds of people who lived and died beside them, long before the world was supposed to work this way. If you're using this to fall asleep tonight, that's exactly what it's here for. So settle in, and if you feel like it, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely read them. It's always something like Nairobi at 3 a.m, or Vancouver just after midnight, or somewhere in rural Japan where no one else is awake. You'll fit right in. And if you're listening on Spotify, go ahead and follow the show there. It's the best way to support what I do, and it's completely ad-free. No music underneath, just the stories. Link is in the description. Now. Back to the tower. The site where it stands has been continuously inhabited, on and off, for longer than almost any other place on Earth with a recorded human presence. Archaeologists call it Tel Sultan. Most people call it ancient Jericho, though that name carries so much biblical weight that it can actually get in the way of seeing what the place really is. The Jericho of the Hebrew Bible, the walls tumbling down, the trumpets, the conquest, that story belongs to a much later period, separated from this tower by thousands of years and several entirely different cultures. The tower we're talking about tonight has nothing to do with those walls. It is older than that story by more than 8,000 years. What Kathleen Kenyon found when she excavated Tel Sultan in the 1950s genuinely unsettled the archaeological world. She had gone looking for the Bronze Age city of the Bible. What she found underneath it, layer after layer down, was something no one had prepared for. A Neolithic settlement of considerable size, with a perimeter wall, a ditch cut into bedrock, and that tower looming out of the ancient soil like a question no one knew how to answer. The site became iconic almost immediately, not because everything about it was understood, but because it forced scholars to push back their assumptions about when and how humans began to organize themselves in complex, deliberate ways. What archaeology can actually tell us from a site like this is worth being honest about from the start. Stone survives. Bone survives sometimes. Soil layers preserve the sequence of events if you read them carefully enough. Charcoal from ancient fires can be dated with reasonable precision using radiocarbon methods. From all of this, archaeologists can infer a great deal. When people were present, roughly how many, what they ate, how they built, how they buried their dead. What archaeology cannot easily tell us is why. It cannot tell us what the tower meant to the people who spent years of collective labour dragging those stones into place. It cannot tell us whether they feared something, celebrated something, or were simply solving a practical problem with the tools and ideas available to them. That gap between what we can measure and what we can only interpret is where most of the interesting disagreements live, and we'll spend a fair amount of time there. Because the honest version of this story is not one where everything snaps into a satisfying explanation. The tower at Jericho is 11,000 years old, and we still do not fully agree on what it was for. Different researchers have looked at the same stones and come away with different conclusions. Flood control, defense, prestige display, astronomical alignment, social signaling. Some of those ideas are better supported than others. None of them are certain. That uncertainty is not a failure of archaeology. It's just the nature of reaching this far back into human time with the tools we have. What we can say is that the people who built it were not acting randomly. They were organized. They had accumulated enough surplus, enough trust, enough shared purpose to undertake a construction project that would have required sustained coordination across seasons, probably across years. They were living in one of the most water-rich locations in an otherwise arid landscape, at the edge of an environmental crisis that was reshaping the entire region. And they were doing something, building something, remembering something, in stone, that no known human community had attempted before at that scale. That's where this story begins. Not with a city, not with a king, not with a name we can read, just a tower rising out of 11,000 years of silence, asking us what we think we know about when it all started. Tel es Sultan sits in the lower Jordan Valley, about 10 kilometers north of the Dead Sea, at one of the lowest points of permanently inhabited land on the surface of the earth. The valley floor here drops to roughly 250 meters below sea level. The landscape around it is dry, almost brutally so in places. Pale limestone hills rising to the west, the Dead Sea glittering in the distance to the south, the Jordan River threading through scrub and tamarisk a few kilometers to the east. It should not, by any obvious logic, be a place where people chose to settle for 11,000 uninterrupted years. And yet they did, because in the middle of all that aridity, something unusual happens at Tel es Sultan. A powerful perennial spring pushes up out of the limestone, cold and reliable and extraordinarily productive. Ancient and modern Arabic both call it Ain es-Sultan, the Sultan's spring, and it discharges enough water to irrigate several hundred acres without any engineering at all. In a landscape where most water sources were seasonal at best and catastrophically unreliable at worst, this spring was something close to miraculous. The vegetation around it, even today, is conspicuously lush against the pale hills. Date palms, reeds, dense green growth. The contrast with the surrounding terrain is stark enough that you can spot the oasis from a considerable distance, which is almost certainly part of why people found it in the first place. The mound itself sits just beside the spring. It is not especially dramatic to look at. From a distance it reads as a low oval hill, roughly 400 meters long and about 100 meters wide, rising perhaps 20 meters above the surrounding plain at its highest point. Nothing about it screams ancient city. It looks, honestly, like an eroded natural feature, which is exactly the kind of thing it gets mistaken for before anyone digs. But it is not natural. It is entirely made of people. Tells are one of the most characteristic features of the ancient Near East, and Tel es Sultan is among the oldest and deepest of them. The word simply means hill in Arabic, but in archaeological usage it refers specifically to a mound formed by the accumulated debris of long-term human occupation. The process is straightforward, almost inevitable. People build a settlement. Walls eventually collapse or are deliberately torn down when a new structure goes up. Mud brick dissolves back into sediment. Ash layers from hearths accumulate. Floors are relaid over and over. Refuse pits are dug and filled. The dead are buried, sometimes within the floors of houses, sometimes in dedicated areas. Slowly, imperceptibly across any individual lifetime, the ground level rises. New buildings go up on top of the rubble of old ones. Over centuries, over millennia, the settlement climbs. Each generation lives slightly higher than the last, unaware that they are adding their own layer to an archive that future researchers will one day read like a geological column. At Tel es Sultan, that column is deep. The mound contains roughly 20 meters of stratified human occupation, and the earliest layers, the ones that concern us most tonight, sit at the very bottom, sealed beneath everything that came after. Bronze Age Jericho is in there, Iron Age Jericho, the Chalcolithic layers, the later Neolithic, and then, below all of it, separated from the surface by thousands of years and dozens of rebuilding cycles, the pre-pottery Neolithic occupation that produced the tower and the wall. The historical Jericho that most people encounter through biblical accounts belongs to the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, an entirely different cultural and temporal world. The sites, the names, the events recorded in later texts refer to settlements built on top of thousands of years of earlier occupation that those later inhabitants probably knew nothing about. When scholars argue about whether archaeology confirms or contradicts the biblical narrative, they're almost always arguing about those upper Bronze Age and Iron Age layers. The deep prehistoric Jericho underneath is something else entirely, a different question, addressed to a different human moment, and it deserves to be kept distinct from all of that later memory. The first serious excavation of Tell es-Sultan happened in 1867, when Charles Warren sank a shaft into the mound on behalf of the Palestine Exploration Fund. Warren was primarily a military engineer, and his methods were exactly what that suggests. He found some things. He understood very little of what he found. Ernst Sellin and Karl Watzinger worked the site more systematically between 1907 and 1909, producing the first real stratigraphic picture, though their dating was unreliable by later standards, and they were working without radiocarbon technology, which wouldn't exist for another 4 decades. John Garstang directed excavations through the 1930s and produced interpretations of the Bronze Age walls that became famous and famously controversial, particularly in connection with the biblical narrative. But it was Kathleen Kenyon, working between 1952 and 1958, who transformed the site's meaning entirely. Kenyon brought a different methodology, one centered on precise stratigraphic reading of soil sections rather than horizontal clearance of floors. She was meticulous about recording the vertical sequence of deposits, about distinguishing one occupation layer from the next, about understanding not just what was found, but where exactly it was found and what was above and below it. Her approach was demanding and slow, and it produced results that no one had anticipated. As her team worked down through the Bronze Age layers, through the Chalcolithic, through the later Neolithic, they encountered evidence of a settlement far older than anything previously recognized at the site. And then the wall, and then the tower. Her interpretation of what she was seeing shifted the entire conversation about the origins of complex settlement. The site was suddenly not just the biblical Jericho. It was evidence of something happening at the very dawn of the Neolithic transition, before pottery, before agriculture had fully consolidated, before any of the usual markers of settled civilization were clearly in place. The dates she eventually assigned, based on the stratigraphic sequence and the early radiocarbon results becoming available in the 1950s, placed the tower and the associated wall in a period somewhere around 9 to 10,000 years BCE. Later calibrations have refined that to approximately 8,000 BCE, and somewhat earlier for the initial occupation of the site, which in our terms translates to roughly 10 to 11,000 years ago. Those dates have been revisited, contested, and refined in the decades since. Radiocarbon dating has improved considerably since Kenyon's era. The calibration curves used to convert raw radiocarbon ages into calendar years have been substantially refined, and several of the key samples from Tell es-Sultan have been reanalyzed. The current consensus places the construction of the tower in the early pre-pottery Neolithic B period, though some researchers argue for an earlier pre-pottery Neolithic A context for at least the initial phases of the wall. The disagreements are not enormous in absolute terms, a few centuries here and there, but they matter for understanding the sequence of events at the site and for comparing it with other early Neolithic sites across the region. Stratigraphy is the backbone of everything at a site like this. The principle is elegantly simple. Lower layers are older. If you can read the sequence of deposits carefully enough, distinguishing one occupation surface from the next, one destruction event from the one above it, you can establish a relative chronology before a single radiocarbon date is run. Material culture adds resolution. Certain tool types, certain architectural styles, certain ways of processing food or burying the dead appear in consistent stratigraphic positions across multiple sites. The pre-pottery Neolithic sequence at Jericho is defined partly by its lithics, the specific forms of flint tools and projectile points found at each level, and partly by the architecture and the burial practices. Radiocarbon dating then anchors that relative sequence to calendar time, with error margins that shrink as more samples are processed and better calibration data becomes available. What emerges from all of this, from Kenyon's excavations and the subsequent reassessments, is a picture of a site that was occupied in the pre-pottery Neolithic period for an extraordinarily long time. Not a brief episode, not a seasonal camp, a sustained multi-generational settlement that grew, rebuilt again, accumulated depth, and left behind one of the most significant prehistoric records on Earth. The layers above the tower and the wall are deep with later human life. Pottery eventually appears, marking a new period. Bronze tools arrive much later. The settlement contracts at some points and expands at others. It was abandoned for long stretches and reoccupied. By the time anyone was writing down stories about Jericho, the tower had been buried for thousands of years, invisible, waiting under all that accumulated human time for Kenyon's team to cut their section through the mound and find it again. But right now, we're not interested in the upper layers. We are going down, past the Bronze Age cities, past the later Neolithic pottery phases, all the way down to the earliest occupation surfaces, to a world before the calendar as we count it, to the edge of a climate event that was reshaping the entire Near East and pushing human communities toward choices that no one had made before. That is where the real story is, and to understand the people who built that tower, we need to understand the world they were living in. If you could stand on the bank of the spring at Telesultan 11 or 12,000 years ago, the first thing that would strike you is that the world is not quite settled yet. The ice age that had dominated the last 100,000 years is ending, but it has not ended cleanly. The climate is wobbling its way towards something like the conditions we know today, and those wobbles matter to people whose lives depend on the timing of rains and the movements of animals. Geologists call this span of time the transition from the late Pleistocene to the early Holocene. Those terms are convenient, but they can be misleading. They sound like sharp boundaries, one age ending and another beginning on a particular date. In reality, it was a drawn-out, uneven process. Glaciers retreated north, then stalled. Sea levels rose, then paused. Forests advanced into old steppe zones, then retreated again. And in the middle of that long, uneven transition, something abrupt happened. Around 12,900 years ago, global and regional climate records show a sharp reversal. Temperatures fell again in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere. In the Near East, where Jericho would one day rise, conditions appear to have become cooler and crucially drier. This episode lasted more than 1,000 years. It is known as the Younger Dryas. Scholars still argue about the exact mechanisms. Some emphasize changes in North Atlantic Ocean circulation triggered by meltwater pulses. Others highlight shifts in atmospheric circulation patterns. There have even been controversial proposals involving comet impacts, though these remain very much debated and far from widely accepted. What is broadly agreed is simpler. After a period of warming and increased rainfall, the Near Eastern environment snapped back toward more arid, less predictable conditions, then, just as abruptly, snapped forward again into the warmer, wetter climate of the early Holocene. For people living on the ground, this wasn't an abstract climatic event. It was the difference between broad, well-watered grasslands and patchy, shrinking patches of usable habitat. Between herds of gazelle scattered across a broad range and those herds concentrating in fewer, more marginal areas, between wild stands of cereals ripening in generous swaths of valley floor and those same stands failing, or ripening unevenly, or disappearing altogether in some years. The late Epipaleolithic communities of the Levant, sometimes grouped under names like Natufian, had already been experimenting with a less mobile way of life before the Younger Dryas struck. In the slightly warmer, wetter conditions just before this cold snap, some groups had begun to build more substantial houses, to revisit the same camp locations year after year, to harvest wild wheat and barley on a large scale. They were still hunter-gatherers, but they were hunter-gatherers pushing in the direction of semi-sedentariness. Then the climate lurched. If you rely on a mix of hunting, plant-gathering, and maybe some early tentative encouragement of useful species, a colder, drier turn is a profound problem. Fewer animals, less reliable stands of wild grain, water sources that fail unexpectedly. Archaeological and paleo-environmental data suggest that some of those early semi-sedentary sites were abandoned or shrank during the Younger Dryas. Mobility once again became a critical survival tool. Groups had to move farther or more often to find what they needed. This is where climate and human decision-making begin to tangle in a particularly intimate way. Uncertainty about rainfall and plant yields does not simply push people to wander aimlessly. It pushes them to think harder about where and how their food is coming from. It encourages experimentation. We see hints of this in the microscopic record. Increases in the use wear on stone tools associated with cutting plants, grinding grains and processing seeds. More frequent presence of grinding stones, mortars and pestles in sites that were still fundamentally forager camps. Pollen and phytolith evidence suggesting that people were not just collecting wild cereals, but perhaps tending patches, weeding, burning or harvesting them in ways that favoured their regrowth. Some of that experimentation may have begun before the Younger Dryas, but the stress of cooler, drier conditions likely intensified it. When wild stands become less reliable, the payoff from learning how to protect, concentrate, or even slightly manipulate those stands rises. Communities faced with dwindling options tend to probe the boundaries of what is possible. At the same time, the geography of safety changed. In a landscape becoming more arid, areas with dependable water took on a new kind of importance. Springs, wetlands, and river junctions became not just convenient stopovers, but potential anchors. This is where oasis ecology enters the story. The Jordan Valley, even in drier phases, is not a uniform desert. It is a mosaic of microenvironments, riverbanks, alluvial fans, rocky uplands, and, in a few fortunate spots, powerful springs emerging from the limestone. Aina Sultan is one of those. Even during harsher periods, its discharge appears to have remained relatively steady, fed by deeper aquifers less immediately sensitive to short-term shifts in rainfall. Around such a spring, a small, self-sustaining ecosystem develops. Moisture supports dense vegetation, reeds, sedges, shrubs, without irrigation. That vegetation in turn attracts animals, birds, small mammals, larger herbivores coming to drink. The moist soils can support wild cereals and other edible plants in higher densities than the surrounding slopes. In effect, a spring like Aina Sultan concentrates food and water into a tight radius. For mobile foragers, this kind of place is a reliable node in a seasonal round. You come when certain plants are ripe. You hunt the animals drawn in by the water. You rest in the shade. Then, in normal years, you move on because other valleys and hillsides also offer what you need. Under Younger Dryas conditions, that equation shifts. If the upland slopes are barer than they used to be, if seasonal streams fail more often, if wild stands of grain are patchier and less predictable, an oasis begins to look less like one node among many and more like a refuge. The cost of leaving increases. The benefits of staying, or at least of returning ever more predictably, grow. This does not automatically produce permanent villages. People do not wake up one morning and decide to invent a settled life because the weather is bad. But the combination of stress and opportunity begins to constrain the range of viable choices. You can move more and risk not finding enough, or you can begin to lean into places where resources are buffered, springs, wetlands, lake margins. At the same time, the plant experiments we mentioned earlier take on a slightly different character if you can reliably return to the same patches, or if you stay near them for longer stretches. Sowing a handful of gathered seeds makes little sense if you may not be back when they ripen. It makes more sense if you're tethered, even loosely, to a particular zone of land. So, on the edge of the Younger Dryas, and into its waning centuries, we can imagine groups in the Jordan Valley making a series of small, practical decisions, returning more often to reliable water, building more substantial shelters because they expect to come back to the same spot, investing time in tending particular stands of wild plants because they have some confidence they will reap the benefits, sharing knowledge of dependable springs and resource patches with allied groups, perhaps formalizing who has rights to what and when. None of this requires foresight about agriculture or cities in any modern sense. It is simply adaptation under pressure, guided by observation. But when we look back on it from the vantage point of Jericho's tower, it is hard not to see these as early steps on a path that would eventually lead to permanent settlement. By the time the Younger Dryas ended and the Holocene climate stabilized into something warmer and generally wetter, groups that had learned to exploit oasis ecologies and to experiment with plants were holding a powerful hand. The world around them was becoming on average more favourable. The spring at Tel Sultan was still flowing. The surrounding soils could support more intensive use. The techniques for grinding, storing, and perhaps even deliberately tending cereals already existed. The question, then, is how that mix of lingering memory of hardship and new environmental opportunity played out at this specific spring. Did people settle here because they were forced by scarcity, or because the oasis offered a surplus that made staying attractive? Or was it some complicated combination of the two, stress and opportunity intertwined? To answer that, we need to look more closely at what life actually looked like in these earlier settled communities, at Jericho and beyond, before the familiar markers of later civilization, pottery, metal, writing, had appeared. Archaeologists have a name for this strange in-between world that follows the Younger Dryas in the Levant, the pre-pottery Neolithic, often shortened to PPN. It is exactly what it sounds like, and at the same time much more than that. On the surface, the label is almost comically negative. These were farming villages, but without pottery, settled communities, but without cities, people gathering in large numbers to build substantial architecture, but without writing, without metal, without the things we often use as shorthand for civilization. And yet, if you walk down through the layers at Tel Sultan in your mind, this is where almost everything changes. The Neolithic in classic archaeological language is the New Stone Age, usually defined by the presence of farming, herding, and polished stone tools. In older textbooks, it sometimes looks like a clear line. One moment, hunter-gatherers. The next, farmers with permanent houses and domestic animals. The ground says otherwise. What we call the pre-pottery Neolithic is really a long, uneven transition. In the southern Levant, it stretches from roughly 10,000 to 7,000 BCE, often divided into an earlier PPNA and a later PPNB. In that span, people go from heavy reliance on wild resources, with some plant tending, to communities that are clearly cultivating cereals and legumes and increasingly managing animals. But the shift is gradual, patchy, and it does not happen the same way or at the same time in every valley. In some regions, people build substantial architecture before they fully commit to farming. In others, plant cultivation appears early, but permanent houses lag behind. In the highlands, in the steppe, along the coast, the balance between hunting, gathering and cultivation differs. Neolithic, in this sense, is not a moment. It is a process, a long, regionally varied experiment in living differently on the land. Jericho, Tell Sultan, is one of the clearest windows into that process. If you could slice the mound open like a cake, you would see layer upon layer of human occupation, a deep, complex sequence running from the earliest PPN levels all the way up into historical times. The earliest substantial Neolithic settlement on the mound belongs to the PPNA, sometime in the 10th millennium BCE. By then, people were already building in mud brick, constructing round or slightly oval houses with plastered floors clustered around the spring. Above those earliest levels come later PPNA and then PPNB layers, where things change again. Houses shift from round to more rectilinear plans. Plaster technology becomes more elaborate. The famous tower and wall belong to this early Neolithic phase. Later still, after a long arc of development, pottery finally appears. But for the first 2,000 or 3,000 years of substantial settlement at Jericho, people are living in what we would call a pre-pottery Neolithic world. What did that actually feel like? On a day-to-day level, life was still anchored in stone tools. Blades and flakes of carefully knapped flint with the universal cutting edges. Sickles made from multiple flint inserts set into a handle were used to harvest cereals. Their glossy wear patterns give them away. Projectile points armed spears and arrows for hunting. Scrapers, barons and drills shaped bone, wood and hides. Without pottery, people turned to other technologies for storing, carrying and processing food. Basketry seems to have been critical. The baskets themselves almost never survive, but impressions in plaster and clay show the weave patterns. Plant fibers twined and plaited into containers, mats and perhaps even roofing elements. Leather bags, wooden bowls and stone basins filled out the toolkit. One of the most distinctive features of the PPN, especially at Jericho, is the use of plaster. This was not a casual material. To make it, people had to collect limestone, heat it to high temperatures in kilns or hearths to create quicklime, and then carefully mix it with water and fillers to produce a workable paste. That paste was spread over floors to create smooth white surfaces, over walls to seal and brighten them, and, as we will see later, over human skulls to recreate the faces of the dead. Every plaster floor embodies a chain of labour and knowledge, quarrying stone, gathering fuel, controlling fire, mixing and applying the material before it's set. The energy investment is significant, which tells us these were not fleeting camps. People expected to live on these surfaces for years. Architecture itself reflects that expectation. The earliest PPN houses at Jericho seem to have been semi-subterranean, with walls sunk into the ground for insulation and superstructures of mud brick and organic materials. Roofs were probably flat, supported by timber and reeds. Within and between these structures, hearths, storage pits, and work areas are repeated, rebuilt, and maintained across generations. This is not yet a city in the sense historians usually mean. It likely lacks permanent markets, formal bureaucracies, written records, and the extreme social stratification of later urban centres. When scholars argue about whether Jericho in the PPN deserves to be called a city, they are really arguing about what we should do with a place that breaks the categories. On one hand, Jericho's early Neolithic settlement is large for its time, perhaps housing several hundred, maybe even upwards of 1,000 people at its peak in certain phases, though estimates vary. It shows coordinated construction on a scale that seems to require some kind of community organisation. The tower and the surrounding wall, the standardised plaster floors, the repetition of building forms, These are not the products of a few nuclear families acting in isolation. On the other hand, we do not yet see the clear signs of institutionalized hierarchy that define later cities like Uruk or Memphis. There are no monumental palaces, no unmistakable elite tombs packed with wealth, no written tablets recording rations or taxes. The scale is impressive, but the social structure appears flatter, more networked, more like an enlarged village than a full urban state. So different scholars use different language. Some speak of Jericho as a large village, others as a protosben, or incipient urban community, a place where some aspects of city life, density, planning, communal works, appear centuries or millennia before others. The debate is less about the stones in the ground and more about how we choose to map our modern categories onto them. What is clear is that, before pottery and long before metal, people at Tell es-Sultan were already living in dense, architecturally complex communities, investing heavily in shared infrastructure and in the surfaces under their feet. They were working stone and plaster and fibre into a coherent way of life that would set the stage for everything that followed. To understand why a community like this would put up a massive stone wall and a towering structure beside it, we first need to look more closely at the resource that made all of it possible, and the way it was woven into everyday routines, the spring and the oasis that gathered around it. If you stand at Tell es-Sultan today, the core of the landscape is the same as it was 10 or 11,000 years ago. Water, appearing almost miraculously at the edge of the desert. Jericho's spring is not a mighty river. It is a steady, reliable flow, fed by groundwater moving through the limestone hills to the west, emerging at the foot of the mound. In a region where rainfall is highly seasonal and often unreliable, that constancy is everything. For people coming out of the younger Dryas experience, that would have mattered in a very particular way. Hunter-gatherer groups in the Levant had long adjusted their movements to the rhythm of the seasons, winter in the lowlands, summer in the uplands. Following the ripening of wild barley, the migration of gazelle, the filling and emptying of seasonal pools, water, food, and movement formed one intertwined pattern. A spring like Jericho's offers a different possibility. When you know that water will be there in August in a dry year, when the ephemeral pools have vanished and the wedges are just lines of stone, your calculus changes. You can risk staying longer. You can begin to imagine not leaving at all. Dependable water doesn't just quench thirst. It changes the menu of choices available to a community. But water, in a place like this, is not a passive backdrop. It is work. Every day in early Jericho would have involved some form of water labour. People had to collect it, carry it, pour it, store it, and keep it usable. Without pottery, that meant baskets lined with pitch or plaster, animal skins, wooden troughs, stone basins. Archaeologists at Jericho have found plastered installations and basins that seem designed to hold and channel water, and floors carefully sloped to direct runoff. Imagine the routine. Morning, perhaps, begins with trips to the spring, vessels in hand, children, adults, all participating to some degree because water is not optional. Each household needs enough for drinking, cooking, soaking grain, washing tools and hands, maybe cooling hot stones or dampening floors to keep down dust. Water also creates problems. Standing water breeds insects. Spilled water and organic waste together produce smells, disease, mud. In a dense settlement, you cannot simply pour wastewater anywhere. It will flow downhill into someone else's house, into shared spaces, back toward the spring. So even in the absence of written rules, there must have been norms, unspoken agreements, and perhaps explicit instructions about what you do with clean water, what you do with dirty water, and where those two must never mix. Sanitation in a pre-pottery Neolithic village does not look like pipes and drains, but it still exists as a pattern of behaviour, where you wash hides, where you butcher animals, where you dump ash from the hearth, where you empty chamber pots or their early equivalents. These patterns are social as much as practical. They set boundaries and expectations. They shape the map in people's heads of clean and unclean, inside and outside, ours and not ours. Access to the spring itself would have been an intensely social matter. In many small-scale societies, important water sources are wrapped in rules. Who may draw first? Who maintains the path? Who is responsible for cleaning? We do not have a law code from Jericho, but we do have the simple fact of density. When many households rely on the same outlet, habits will emerge, and with them forms of authority. Perhaps certain lineages took on the role of managing the spring. Perhaps work groups formed to dredge channels, repair plastered basins, clear reeds. Perhaps everyone simply knew that on particular days or at certain hours, specific tasks were done, and everyone else stayed clear. Whatever the details, water is the axis around which the early settlement turns. It also makes possible a set of practices that blur the line between foraging and farming. When you have year-round water, you can do more than simply gather whatever happens to grow nearby. You can tend. People in the Natufian period before Jericho were already experimenting with tending wild stands of cereals, cutting back competitors, scattering seed, returning deliberately to favoured patches. At an oasis like Tell Sultan, those practices gain new power. Small plots near the spring could be encouraged, weeded, maybe even lightly watered during dry spells. Seeds from particularly plump ears of barley or wheat could be sown closer to home. Lentils, peas and other legumes might be coaxed along at the damp margins. This is not yet full-blown, irrigated agriculture, with canals and fields laid out in strict order, but it is something more than simple gathering. It is cultivation in embryo. Water also attracts animals. Even if no one in early PPN Jericho was yet herding sheep and goats in the full domestic sense, wild herds would have moved through the oasis, especially in dry seasons. Gazelle, ibex, aurochs, small game, birds, drawn like humans to the scarce resource. For hunters, that creates opportunities. For people experimenting with the management of animals, it creates possibilities. Repeated encounters with particular herds, chances to observe breeding and behaviour, perhaps early forms of protection or corralling. Later, Neolithic levels in the region show clear evidence of managed goats. At Jericho, the oasis likely served as part of that longer story, a place where human and animal calendars began to intertwine. As the space around the spring fills with people, plants and animals, water becomes more than a resource. It becomes a centre that needs to be defended, not only from outside threats, but from disorder. If everyone wants their house as close as possible to the spring, where do you draw the line? How far out do the dwellings extend before you say, beyond this point is field, or pasture, or open land? Where do work areas end and spaces for sleep and ritual begin? How do you keep animals from trampling the plots you have so carefully tended near the water's edge? Archaeologists often talk about territoriality in this context, the ways people mark, claim and negotiate space. At an oasis, territoriality is not abstract. It is literally the difference between having easy access to clean water and walking a long way with heavy loads every day. The simplest form of territorial marking is a path, a worn track to the spring. The next step might be a low wall, a line of stones, a hedge of thorns. Over generations, as population grows and investments in houses and plots deepen, these lines tend to become more formal. This is one way to think about the famous wall of Jericho and the tower that stands just inside it. Traditionally, especially when viewed through the lens of much later city walls, people assumed that any early stone wall encircling a settlement must be a fortification, protection against enemies. That remains one possible function, and episodes of conflict surely occurred in the long history of the site. But when we place the wall and tower back into their pre-pottery Neolithic context, another interpretation comes into view. A substantial stone wall around an oasis settlement can act as a membrane. It separates the dense interior space of houses, courtyards, and work areas from the exterior space of fields, pastures, and wild land. It shapes the flow of people, animals, and water into and out of the community. The tower, rising from the inside edge of that wall, may be part of the same system. Not just a defensive lookout, but a vantage point from which to monitor movement at the settlement's boundary. Who is coming in to draw water? Who is driving animals past the gate? Who is approaching from the wadi? In this reading, the wall and tower are not separate from the story of water. They are extensions of it, architectural expressions of the need to manage the precious centre of life, the spring, and the crowded, contested space that has grown up around it. As we move closer to the daily life of Jericho's inhabitants, to their houses and hearths, it helps to keep that image in mind. A dense cluster of homes wrapped around a dependable source of water, encircled in turn by stone, all of it held together by routines of labour and shared understandings about where and how the flows of life should move. If we follow one of those worn paths away from the spring and step inside the ring of stone, the scale shifts. The wall, the tower, the water, all of that is the big picture. But the real experiment of Jericho is happening at ground level, in places no higher than your knees. Archaeologists learning to read early villages talk a lot about floors. At Tel Sultan, the earliest pre-pottery Neolithic houses aren't grand. They're usually small, often round or slightly oval in the earliest levels, sometimes moving toward more rectilinear forms later. Walls are made from mud brick or packed earth, sometimes supported by stone foundations. The real work, though, goes into the floors. Again and again, excavators find sequences of carefully plastered surfaces. A floor is laid, used, patched. When it cracks or sags, people don't abandon the spot. They bring in fresh fill, level it, and spread a new layer of lime plaster. Sometimes this happens 5, 10, 15 times in the same footprint. Each floor is only a few centimetres thick, but stacked together, they become a vertical record of persistence. A family, or a lineage, choosing to rebuild in place rather than move on. And embedded in those floors, and in the thin layers between them, are the clues to everyday life. Bits of charcoal from fires, tiny fish bones, fragments of plant husk, broken tools too worn to save, accidentally dropped beads. The hearths are often just as modest. A shallow pit, a slightly raised rim, an area of reddened earth where heat has altered the soil. Sometimes there is a ring of stones. Sometimes only an irregular patch of ash and burnt bone marks the centre of warmth and cooking. These aren't the great altars or monumental fireplaces of later temples. They are workstations, social nodes, and heat sources all at once. It is around these low, ordinary features that people at Jericho spent a large share of their waking hours. Close to the hearths, and often embedded right into those plaster floors, we start to see the machinery of a changing diet. Grinding stones, large flat slabs known as querns or grinding slabs, turn up in house after house. On them, smaller handstones once moved back and forth, hour after hour, reducing grain and seeds to flour. The stones themselves sometimes show shallow hollows from use, smooth depressions where hands and grain wore them down. In some cases, they've been set into the floor as if to make a permanent workstation. Nearby, archaeologists find storage pits, sometimes lined with plaster, cut down into the earth beneath the living spaces. They may have held grain, pulses, dried fruits, perhaps nuts. Taken together, these features suggest a new rhythm. Instead of moving through the landscape to meet the food where it ripens, food is being brought here, in bulk and transformed. Grinding grain by hand is slow, repetitive, and demanding. Ethnographic studies of traditional communities that still mill by hand suggest hours of labour each day, often falling disproportionately on women and older children. At Jericho, the spread of grinding equipment hints at households investing that kind of time, turning wild or semi-tended cereals into porridge, flatbreads, and gruels. The refuse tells the same story from another angle. In the middens and rubbish pits, and in the thin lenses of discarded material that build up just outside house walls, we see changing proportions of animal bones and charred plant remains. Over time, there tends to be more evidence of concentrated plant processing and storage, more signs of commitment to grain and legumes. The menu is still mixed. Hunting and gathering have not vanished, but the balance is shifting. If we zoom out from one house to the cluster, another pattern comes into view. Early Jericho is not a single, uniform block of identical units. It is a mosaic of small households pressed close together, sharing walls, alleys, and workspaces. One person's back wall is another person's courtyard boundary. One hearth's smoke drifts across several roofs. In such a setting, privacy is thin. Sound carries through mud brick and reed. Smells from cooking, tanning hides, fermenting food, and human waste blend and travel. People are almost always in one another's peripheral vision. This density makes cooperation both easier and more necessary. If you need help raising a new roof beam, your neighbours are only a few steps away. If someone falls sick, word will spread quickly, and assistance, whether in the form of food, childcare, or shared labour, can arrive without delay. Grinding stones, ovens, and work areas may be shared, or at least frequently borrowed between households, especially among close kin. At the same time, friction is inevitable. Where does one family's swept area end and another's begin? Who has the right to dump ash in this corner or to tether a goat near that wall? If someone habitually leaves fish heads or offal just outside their door, the flies won't respect property lines. We don't have records of arguments from Jericho, but we do have the physical traces of how people addressed the underlying issues. Pits dug outside houses to concentrate rubbish. Zones where ash and broken tools accumulate, suggesting designated dump areas. Hard-surfaced paths where sweeping seems to have been routine. These are the material shadows of social agreements, spoken or unspoken rules about where things go, who cleans what, and how mess is kept at least somewhat under control. Permanence, even of the modest kind represented by a mud brick house with replastered floors, creates problems that a mobile band can mostly avoid. Waste is one. Insects and rodents are another. As food stores grow more substantial, sealed pits of grain, baskets of dried pulses, the settlement becomes more attractive to mice, rats, and beetles. We don't yet have written pest reports from Jericho, but remains of certain species and gnaw marks on bones and wood tell us that commensal animals were finding their way in. Storing food in the floor, sealing pits with plaster, perhaps hanging certain items from rafters or placing them on raised platforms. All of these can be read as partial strategies to keep precious calories away from small thieves. Then there is the problem of smoke and air. In closely packed houses with central hearths and limited openings, managing fire safely is a communal concern. A stray ember can set a thatched roof alight. Too much smoke in still weather can make whole clusters of rooms unpleasant. Architectural solutions, vents, small openings, perhaps shared courtyards where fires could be lit in good weather, intersect with social ones. Norms about when you cook, about watching children near flames, about sharing fuel. In this way, the physical layout of Jericho, its close-set houses, its layered floors, its hearths and pits, becomes a kind of script for social behaviour. To live here successfully, people had to coordinate. They had to signal, negotiate, adapt. They needed small-scale rules long before anyone carved a law into stone. Some rules would have been enforced by simple irritation. If you leave rubbish in the wrong place and your neighbours complain, you adjust. Others may have crystallized into more formal expectations, elders mediating disputes about boundaries, or particular families recognized as owners of certain workspaces or paths. We cannot see those conversations, but we can see their long-term outcome. A village that holds together long enough for those many layers of plaster to build up underfoot. And as those houses accumulate history, with floors built over floors, and sometimes, as we'll see later, with the dead quite literally beneath the living, Jericho's inhabitants are not just solving practical problems. They are also, slowly, binding themselves to place in a way that will make the next step in the story possible. The deliberate cultivation of food at a scale no purely mobile group could attempt. When we picture the invention of agriculture, it is tempting to imagine a moment. Someone sticks a seed in the ground on purpose, waits, and a few months later looks around and realizes history has changed. What happened at Jericho and across the Levant in the pre-pottery Neolithic looks nothing like that. It is slower, more ambiguous, more like learning to lean on processes that were already happening in the landscape. For tens of thousands of years before anyone built a wall at Telesultan, people in this region knew wild cereals, einkorn, emmer, barley, along with a long list of other grasses and useful plants. They knew when and where they ripened, what soils they preferred, how they responded to wet years and dry years. They had stone sickles and baskets and grinding stones long before the first permanent villages appeared. The shift at Jericho is not the discovery that these plants are edible. It is the quiet decision to start managing them. Management, in this early sense, doesn't have to be dramatic. You might begin by returning to the same patch of wild barley year after year, knocking seed heads into baskets but leaving the shorter, less promising stalks standing to reseed the ground. Over time you could start favouring grains that shatter less easily, that stay on the stalk until you cut them, simply because they're easier to harvest and carry. You might burn rival vegetation at particular seasons, opening up patches of ground so that your preferred cereals can spread. You might scatter a handful of grain near camp at the end of harvest instead of letting it all fall wherever the wind and your footsteps dictate. None of this looks like a field in the modern sense. To an outside eye it might still look like a patchy stand of wild grass on a slope above the spring. But viewed across decades or centuries, the human hand is there. More grain where you expect it, heads a little fatter, stems a little more uniform, ripening in a pattern that matches your calendar. Archaeologists have to be very cautious about how they read these changes. When charred seeds and husks turn up in Jericho's floors and pits, they do not come with labels saying wild or domesticated. Specialists look for subtle anatomical signs, changes in the way grains attach to the ear, shifts in seed size, differences in husk structure. They compare samples from many layers and many sites, trying to see whether the plants at Jericho were still essentially wild stands being harvested, or whether they had begun to respond to generations of human selection. The evidence suggests a long, messy transition. In some layers, cereal remains still look mostly wild. In later levels, more grains show the non-shattering traits associated with domestication. Even then, domesticated doesn't mean perfectly tamed. It means the balance has tipped. These plants now rely heavily on humans to reproduce effectively. And this story is not a straight one-way line. In some regions, early cultivation experiments seem to stall or even reverse. People may have tried sowing and tending plots, then backed off when climate shifted, when disease or pests intervened, or when other foods proved more reliable. The same community might be intensifying plant management in one generation and leaning harder on hunting the next. At Jericho, this long experimentation plays out in the relationship between surplus, storage, and staying put. If you can bring in a good harvest of grain or pulses and keep them safe for months, the lean seasons become less terrifying. A pit full of cereal under your floor, a cache of dried legumes, baskets of figs or dates. These are not just food. They are time turned solid, hours of foraging and hunting condensed into something you can unwrap later. The more successful you become at turning the spring's water and the nearby slope's vegetation into durable surplus, the more sense it makes to anchor yourself near that spring, near those plots. Moving away would mean walking out on the investment you've made in tweaking the local plant communities, in learning every contour where barley does best and every corner where frost lingers. But surplus is never entirely secure. Grain can rot, mould, be eaten by insects, raided by rodents, stolen by human neighbours, or lost to flood and fire. A community that is starting to depend on stored plant food has to think constantly about risk. One response is architectural: deeper pits, better plaster linings, more carefully sealed lids. Perhaps small above-ground structures devoted mostly to drying and storage. Another response is social: agreements about who contributes to which granary, who can draw on shared stores in an emergency, who guards what. And at a certain point, surplus becomes heavy in another sense. It ties you not just to a place, but to obligations. If some households have particularly good fields or better access to water, they may accumulate more grain than they can eat in a season. That surplus can be shared, traded, lent, or displayed. It can feed visitors, smooth over conflicts, support specialists who spend more time building or digging or conducting rituals and less time gathering their own food. This is where early cultivation at Jericho shades into the possibility of large communal projects. A tower, a substantial wall, repeated replastering of shared spaces, all of these require labour concentrated in time. People have to be free, at least for periods, from the immediate pressure of finding that day's meal. Grain in storage makes that imaginable. At the same time, the very act of investing in walls and towers can be seen as another form of risk management. If your village now holds months of food in its pits and bins, the cost of a flood, a raid, or a landslide is far greater than it was for a mobile band with only what they can carry. Building physical defences, managing water flow, marking boundaries between inside and outside may no longer be optional. So cultivation and construction feed into one another. The slowly changing plants outside the walls enable surpluses that make staying in one place feasible. Staying in one place makes managing those plants more effective. Surplus makes large building projects possible. And those projects, in turn, shape how secure that surplus feels. By the time Jericho's inhabitants are setting stone on stone to form a great circular tower, they're no longer just opportunistic gatherers who happen to be in a lucky spot. They are co-authors of the landscape itself, tinkering with plant evolution and architecture in the same long conversation. To understand why they might go to the trouble of raising a massive wall around their settlement, we have to keep this invisible revolution in mind. The gradual, reversible, always local shift from finding food to growing it, without any script to follow. When archaeologists first peeled back the layers of the mound at Tel es-Sultan in the mid-20th century, the wall came into view as a shock. Beneath later Bronze Age fortifications and long before bricks and pottery, there was an older ring, a massive stone wall more than a metre thick running around the edge of the settlement. In places its surviving height reaches 3 to 4 metres, built not of tiny pebbles, but of substantial, roughly shaped stones stacked in courses. It hugs the base of the mound, more or less following the contour where the inhabited area drops off toward the surrounding plain. In its earliest phases it seems to form a continuous belt, an artificial skin at the edge of the village, with houses and open areas packed just inside. This is not a low terrace wall or a casual boundary. For a pre-pottery Neolithic community, it is ambitious engineering. It requires knowing where to dig foundations, how to seat stones so they do not slide on each other, how to keep an almost circular structure stable on a slope. When you put a substantial wall around a settlement, the most straightforward interpretation almost writes itself: fortification. In the first decades after its discovery, Jericho's early wall was widely described as the world's oldest city wall, a defense against enemies. The story was appealing. Here, at the dawn of farming, was a community already worried about raids. You can imagine people outside trying to get at stored grain, livestock, or the spring, and people inside wanting a barrier. There are reasonable grounds for that view. By the time this wall is standing, Jericho is already an unusually large settlement for its era. Where there is surplus and concentration of people, there is the possibility of conflict. Stone walls can slow down attackers, channel them toward narrow entrances, and provide higher ground from which defenders might throw stones or spears. And yet the archaeological details make the simple Fortress Jericho picture harder to sustain. For one thing, this early wall is not obviously crowned with towers or parapets in the way later Bronze Age fortifications are. We do not see clear evidence of a walkway on top, of arrow slits or purpose-built bastions for fighting. The famous tower at Jericho does not protrude from the wall like a gate tower. It nestles just inside, attached at the base. For another, the wall sits low, at the foot of the settlement mound, rather than high up on the crest where defenders would have the greatest tactical advantage. From outside, once the tell had built up, an aggressor might actually be able to occupy slightly higher ground relative to the wall's base. There is also the problem of scale versus armament. A 1-meter thick stone wall is an obstacle, but we have no evidence that these early villagers had siege technology to fear, nor that their potential enemies did. A determined human can climb a few meters of rough stone if no one is standing on top to stop them. If the wall's primary purpose was fighting, we might expect clearer signs of a defensive superstructure. These puzzles have led many researchers to think beyond warfare. The placement of the wall at the base of the mound, close to the wadi and the spring, has suggested a different story. Water and earth rather than spears and shields. Tell Sultan sits beside a seasonal watercourse and above a powerful perennial spring. In flood, a wadi can become dangerous in hours. Heavy rain on the surrounding hills can send sudden torrents down the channel, eroding banks, undercutting slopes and dumping debris at the base of the settlement. Seen from this perspective, a continuous stone wall is not just a barrier against people. It is a retaining structure, holding the edge of the mound in place, protecting houses from washouts, and perhaps deflecting floodwaters around the settlement rather than through it. In some sections, the wall seems almost like a revetment, supporting the slope behind it. The tower built against the inside of that wall could then be read as keyed into a system that stabilizes both earth and stone, rather than as a battlefield lookout. There is also the social geography to consider. Even if the wall had some role in managing water and erosion, it still draws a very clear line. Inside is us, the cluster of houses, hearths and courtyards tied into shared routines. Outside is everything else: hunting grounds, plant gathering areas, other groups' territories. Crossing that stone boundary would not have felt trivial. It marks a threshold, and thresholds have social power. They tell you where you're expected to sleep, who is supposed to share whose food, where guests become strangers and strangers become guests. Some scholars emphasize this role. The wall as a statement of community, an early architectural way of saying, this is our space. Not necessarily against a specific enemy, but as an ongoing act of definition. Of course, these interpretations are not mutually exclusive. A wall that helps hold back floodwater also makes it harder for hostile visitors to rush into the village. A structure that marks where inside ends and outside begins can be used, in times of tension, as defensive line. Over generations, people's reasons for repairing the wall may shift. The original builders may have worried more about erosion. Their descendants, living in a slightly different social landscape, may lean on the same stones as a shield against human threats. Archaeologists try to untangle these possibilities by looking outward as well as inward. They compared Jericho to other early sites in the region. Some pre-pottery Neolithic villages have modest perimeter constructions. Others seem entirely open. Some sit in flood-prone settings where retaining walls make sense. Others do not. The pattern suggests that not every large village felt the same needs or had the same options. They also reconstruct ancient environments, mapping former wadi channels, testing sediments for flood deposits, modelling how water would have moved across the landscape 11,000 years ago. Where flood signatures coincide with substantial stonework, the flood control hypothesis gains weight. At the same time, evidence for intergroup contact, shared tool styles, exotic materials moving between sites, hints at both cooperation and competition. In a world where groups visited each other, traded, and perhaps also envied each other's access to water and good soils, it would be naive to exclude conflict from the picture altogether. So the wall at Jericho resists being pinned down to a single clear function. It is likely part retaining structure, part boundary marker, part potential fortification, its meaning and importance evolving as the community itself changed. By the time the Great Tower rises just inside it, wall and tower together form a coupled system, stone encircling the settlement horizontally, stone reaching upward in a vertical gesture. To understand that system, we have to step through the wall and climb inside the tower itself. Walk through that wall in your imagination and you find the most unexpected thing in the village. Not a chief's house, not a temple. A hollow cone of stone, pressed right up against the inner face of the wall, wider at its base than most people's homes, and rising higher than anything else around it. The Jericho Tower, in its earliest preserved form, is about 8 to 9 meters tall. That is the height of a modern 3-story building. Its base is roughly 9 meters across, a thick circular shell of stone enclosing a packed core. The walls are made of undressed field stones stacked in courses, with smaller stones used as chinking. There is no mortar in the modern sense, but the careful fitting of the blocks and the mass of the structure itself holds everything in place. It does not taper to a sharp point. Instead, it narrows as it rises, more like a very tall truncated cone or a thick-walled cylinder with a slightly sloping profile. On the outside there are no elaborate carvings, no obvious decorations, just layer upon layer of stone, rising from foundations cut slightly into the slope of the mound and tied into the base of the surrounding wall. The most striking feature is inside. Set into the thickness of the masonry is a staircase, spiralling gently up along the inner wall. The steps are stone, projecting from the side, each tread roughly the length of a human foot, worn at the edges from use. They climb in a tight arc until they emerge near the top, where there must once have been a platform, perhaps of wood, perhaps of stone, now largely gone. Archaeologists can reconstruct the tower's life history by reading traces like these the way a geologist reads strata in a cliff. The way stones are bedded tells you which parts were laid at the same time and which were added later. Changes in the colour and compaction of fill inside the tower hint at episodes when people cleaned it out, repaired it, or partially infilled it. If later layers of debris and floor surfaces butt up against the tower at a certain height, they give a minimum estimate for how tall the structure already was when those layers formed. Radiocarbon dates from organic material trapped in the construction fill and in associated floors bracket the period of initial building and later use. The tower belongs to the earlier pre-pottery Neolithic A and the beginning of B, roughly 11,000 years ago, and shows signs of repair and modification as the settlement around it evolved. From the pattern of stone transport and the scale of the masonry, researchers can estimate labour. The volume of stone involved is immense for a community of perhaps a few hundred people. There are no pack animals yet, no metal tools. Each stone had to be quarried or collected from nearby outcrops and wadis, carried or dragged to the site, and then lifted into place. Even under generous assumptions, many workers, long work days, efficient organisation, you're looking at weeks if not months of coordinated effort, all for a structure that, as far as we can tell, housed no one. So what did it do? One line of interpretation takes the tower at face value, an elevated place to stand. From the top platform you could look out across the oasis, watch the wadi, scan the approaches from the desert and hills. In a village with low single-story houses, such a vantage point would be unique. It could help people spot approaching herds, incoming visitors, or rising floodwaters moving down the channel. In that sense, the tower might have been part of a broader system of watching the landscape, an early kind of communal lookout, tied both to practical concerns and to the rhythms of daily life. Someone ascending the internal staircase at dawn or dusk could have seen the sun rise or set against particular ridgelines, perhaps noting seasonal changes useful for timing, planting, harvesting, or hunting trips. Other readings emphasize the inside rather than the view. The staircase itself is an experience, enclosed, dark, cool, with the outside world falling away as you move upward. To climb it is to follow a prescribed path, one body at a time, in single file. This has led some scholars to wonder whether the tower also had a ceremonial side, a place where processions ascended, where certain people, elders, ritual specialists, initiates, went up for particular occasions while others watched from below. There is a temptation to make it into a temple tower, or to assign it a very specific ritual function, but the evidence is thin. We do not have altars preserved at the top, or rich caches embedded in the walls, or clear iconography carved into the stones. What we have is the sheer fact of height, the choreographed movement of the stair and its position at the inner edge of the community's boundary. Those basic facts open possibilities but do not decide between them. The tower could have been multi-purpose. In ordinary times it might have been a way to survey the fields and control access to the spring. In extraordinary moments, seasonal gatherings, crises, communal decisions, it might have become a focal point, a raised place from which someone addressed the assembled households, or where shared rituals unfolded under the open sky. Behind all these interpretations sits a deeper question. Why height and why stone at this particular moment? These people already knew how to build in mud brick and organic materials. A wooden tower or raised earthen platform would have been technically easier, quicker, and less demanding. Instead, they chose the heaviest, most durable material available, and they raised it higher than any house, binding it into the very line that separated inside from outside. That choice suggests that something about being up there, above the roofs, above the daily clutter of hearths and courtyards, mattered enough to justify a huge expenditure of collective energy. Whether that something was primarily watching for floods, marking the seasons, asserting communal identity, enacting rituals, or some evolving combination of all of these, we cannot be sure. What we can see is the pattern, a community willing to coordinate, to plan, and to move hundreds of tons of stone in order to create a shared vertical space that no single family controlled. In the shadow of that tower, the organization of life at Jericho begins to look different. If you can assemble enough people to build this, you can probably assemble them to do other large tasks. The staircase curling inside the stone is not just a route upward, it is a trace of the social steps needed to persuade and coordinate a village without kings. To understand how that worked, we need to look beyond the stones themselves and ask how hundreds of individuals, with no palaces or written laws, managed to agree on projects of this scale. Imagine Jericho on an ordinary day, Long before anyone thought in terms of rulers and subjects, you wake up in a one-room house. You know almost everyone you see when you step outside. Cousins, in-laws, people you have grown up with. The settlement is not a city in the later sense. It is an expanded neighbourhood of overlapping families. Authority here does not come from written edicts or royal seals. It comes from age, reputation, and the quiet weight of custom. In a community like this, organised labour does not mean a foreman shouting orders at anonymous workers. It looks more like a very large, very complicated family chore. People whose houses sit along the same lane already help one another with heavy work, repairing walls, raising a roof beam, digging out a collapsed hearth. When the task grows too large for one house cluster, like lifting massive stones for a tower, the circle of obligation widens. Your mother reminds you that your father's brother's people helped when your wall washed out last winter. Now it is your turn to help them. Refusing is not just rude. It risks cutting yourself off from future help. One of the most powerful tools for coordination in a place without clocks or written schedules is simply shared time. Everyone lives under the same sky. The annual flood pulse in the wadi, the moment when certain birds arrive or particular wild plants flower, the day the sun rises between two familiar peaks. These are markers that tell you what should happen when. Archaeologists can't recover their exact calendar, but we know from other early farming communities that tasks tend to cluster around key seasonal thresholds. First sowing, first weeding, first harvest, the onset of the dry season. If the tower had any role in watching the sun's path or the approach of floodwaters, then it may also have been folded into this seasonal logic. A certain alignment of light on the hillside, a certain shadow falling along the inner wall could be the signal. The time has come to bring stone, to strengthen the wall, to clear the stair. Alongside seasonal timing, there are the unwritten rules everyone knows. You help when called, you are fed when you help. You share labour now, and others will share with you when you need it. Anthropologists call this reciprocal obligation, and it appears in small-scale societies across the world. You do not need courts to enforce it. Gossip, praise, and disapproval are enough. A household that never contributes will find fewer hands showing up when its roof cracks or its stores run low. Collective projects also become occasions. If half the settlement is hauling stone, someone has to provide food and water. That means other households grinding more grain, roasting more meat, maybe pooling reserves that would not be opened on an ordinary day. A work party shades into a feast. People who rarely see one another beyond their own lanes meet, exchange news, negotiate marriages, settle small grievances while their hands are busy. In such settings, ritual easily blends with labour. A short chant before the first stone is laid, a promise spoken by an elder, a small offering tucked into the foundation. These are ways of turning back-breaking work into something more than mere exertion. They say, in effect, we're not just moving rocks, we're renewing the boundary, we're keeping the water safe, we're doing what our grandparents did. Feasts and shared rites can smooth over the tensions that come with any big project. If two households are in dispute over a field, pouring their energy into the same wall or tower, eating from the same cooking pot at the end of the day, gives the community space to cool tempers and reweave frayed ties. The project itself becomes a neutral focus, something larger than any one quarrel. Within this apparently flat landscape of kin and neighbours, skill still matter. Some people at Jericho would have been especially good at reading stone, knowing which slabs would split cleanly and which would crumble. Others would be adept at laying foundations on a slope, judging weight and angle by eye. Still others might be known for designing things, deciding how thick a wall must be, how wide to make the stair, where to cut the drainage channel. These are roles, masons, planners, toolmakers, but they do not necessarily map onto rigid ranks. The best stoneworker may sleep in a house no bigger than anyone else's. Their authority is situational. When you're setting courses, you listen to them. When you're curing hides or diagnosing an illness, you defer to someone else. Hierarchy here is narrow and task-bound, not yet the broad, permanent inequality of later chiefdoms. The tools of coordination are similarly light. A few respected elders can call a meeting at the base of the tower or under a favoured tree. Someone stands where everyone can hear and lays out the problem. The wall is slumping, the last flood bit deeper, a new line of stone must be added before the next season. People murmur, suggest, remember what was done the last time. Agreement emerges not from decree but from a thick web of shared experience. All of this makes the tower more than just an impressive pile of rock. It is a fossilized trace of social complexity that does not rely on kings, scribes, or tax collectors. The very fact that it exists tells us that people at Jericho could plan over months, mobilize dozens of households, coordinate specialized skills, and bind the whole effort together with norms, feasts, and perhaps ritual performances, without leaving behind a single written order. When we look up the spiral of that internal staircase, we are not just seeing architectural ingenuity, we are seeing a kind of politics before politics as we usually imagine it. Consensus built in courtyards, obligations carried in memory, schedules set by the sky. The tower stands as quiet evidence that human beings were capable of complex, large-scale cooperation while their world was still made of mud brick, stone and stories. And if they could organize themselves to raise and maintain this great shared structure, we can ask what else they were capable of constructing together, not in stone this time, but in how they remembered, honoured, and related to those who had gone before. When archaeologists first dug into the Neolithic layers at Tel es-Sultan, they found something that did not fit comfortably into any modern category of art, burial, or furniture. Beneath house floors and in shallow pits, they uncovered human skulls that had been carefully removed from bodies, then reshaped with plaster. Faces were rebuilt in white lime. Noses modelled, cheeks rounded, lips adjusted. In some cases, cowrie shells were pressed into the plaster as the eyes. A few skulls seemed to have been painted, the features highlighted in red or black. To get to this point, somebody had to do quite a bit of work. First, the dead were buried in or near the settlement. When the flesh had decayed enough, the grave was reopened and the skull detached from the rest of the skeleton. That alone implies a familiarity with decomposition, a willingness to return to the grave and handle remains that were no longer entirely bone. The skull was then cleaned and prepared. The base was plugged. The jaw might be removed or stabilized. Wet plaster, burned limestone slaked with water, was applied in small, patient layers. Whoever did this had to understand how plaster behaved as it dried, how much weight a fragment of bone could bear, how to build up a nose that would not simply crumble away. The result was not a generic head form. Many of the Jericho skulls show individual variation, slightly crooked mouths, asymmetrical cheeks, the hint of age worn into the lines around the eyes. It is hard to avoid the sense that at least some of these were meant to recall specific people. The leading interpretation among archaeologists is ancestor veneration. In this reading, the plastered skulls are not trophies taken from enemies, but cherished relics of kin. They may have belonged to household founders, grandparents, or other significant elders whose presence still mattered after death. Reworking the skull into a durable, somewhat lifelike object could be a way of keeping that presence close, of turning a body that would otherwise vanish into something that could anchor memory. This fits several strands of evidence. The skulls tend to be found in domestic contexts, beneath house floors, tucked into platforms, occasionally grouped together as if stored. They are not off in a separate cemetery or temple. They are literally built into the architecture of daily life. When you sat by the hearth, slept against the raised bench, or swept the packed earth of your floor, you were moving over and around the dead. In a community where authority is grounded in age and reputation rather than written charters, the ability to point, quite literally, to your ancestors would matter. A plastered skull could quietly say, "Our lineage has been here for generations. Our claims to this house plot, this irrigation channel, this cluster of trees are backed by the weight of the dead." But ancestor veneration is not the only possible reading. Some scholars see in the skulls an early form of identity marker, a way of making visible the ties that bound a household together. Grouped skulls might represent a chain of descent, a miniature genealogy rendered in bone and plaster. Displaying or tending to them could reaffirm who belonged, which children traced their ancestry through which line, where obligations of inheritance and support lay. Others emphasize the emotional side, exhuming a loved one's skull months after burial, reforming their face with your own hands, giving them eyes again. This can also be seen as an act of grief, of refusal to let go too quickly. In societies without photographs, a plastered skull might be one of the few ways to stabilize a fading memory. Touching the smooth plaster, tracing the curve of the brow, you could talk to someone whose voice you still half remembered. Still others stress the social dimension. If several households participate in similar skull rituals, visiting one another's plastered ancestors on certain days, bringing offerings, telling stories tied to each named cranium, then the practice becomes a shared script. It weaves individual losses into a common pattern. Everyone learns what a good death and a properly remembered life look like, and this shared understanding helps hold the community together. What is clearest in the archaeology is the link between the dead and the idea of home. These are not portable relics carried on long journeys. They're fixed beneath thresholds, platforms, and walls. A house at Jericho is not just shelter from weather or a place to store grain. It is layered time, the living on top, the dead below, and the stories that connect them circulating in the space between. When people repaired a floor, added a room, or rebuilt a wall, they were not simply modifying a structure. They were moving within a landscape that contained their own past. Every new layer of plaster on a bench might echo the plaster laid around a skull just below. The same technology that smoothed a sleeping platform could also reconstruct a face, lime-bound bone and brick together in a continuous material cycle. This blurs the line between domestic and sacred. There is no need for a distant temple if the spirits that matter most are literally under your feet. Ritual can happen in the ordinary flow of life. A whispered word when you step over a particular spot, a small food offering placed in a crack in the floor, a moment of silence when a child is told, "Your mother's mother lies there." At the same time, we have to be cautious. The number of plastered skulls found at Jericho is relatively small compared to the generations who must have lived and died there. Preservation is uneven. Some skulls may have been destroyed by later building, erosion, or lime recycling. Customs also seem to change over time. The practice appears, flourishes for a few centuries, then fades or transforms. What held meaning for one generation might have meant something slightly different for their great-grandchildren. Nor is Jericho unique. Similar skull treatments turn up at other pre-pottery Neolithic sites in the Levant, suggesting broader regional traditions with local variations. Some communities favoured single skulls, others arranged many together. Some emphasized facial modelling, others left the bone more visible. Each case nudges our interpretation, but none provides a simple key that unlocks all the rest. So when we imagine these plastered skulls in their original context, we have to hold several possibilities at once. They may have been ancestors, witnesses, land claims, grief objects, identity badges, or all of these layered together. What we can say with some confidence is that in early Jericho, death did not remove people from the social world. It relocated them. The dead were folded into the very fabric of the house, present in its floors and platforms, invoked whenever someone pointed down and said, "This is ours. We remember." And just as the tower and walls show us how the living at Jericho coordinated their labour and managed their environment, these quiet plastered faces hint at how they coordinated their memories, how they turned fragile recollection into something solid enough to build upon, and how that concern with the dead may have shaped the next layer of shared spaces and rituals that rose above them. If the dead were woven into the houses, what does that make the big shared structures? In later cities, we are used to a clear division. There are ordinary buildings where people live and work, and there are temples, tall, conspicuous, set apart. You go to them for ritual, you leave them and return to normal life. At pre-pottery Neolithic Jericho, that separation is much harder to see. Most of the excavated architecture at Tell es-Sultan looks, at first glance, domestic. Rectangular rooms, rounded silos, low platforms, storage pits. No towering ziggurat, no columned sanctuary. Yet scattered among these houses are features that feel different. A slightly oversized room, a curious raised bench, a floor that has been replastered so many times it is more like a polished stage than a surface you casually spill grain on. Instead of a temple district, we seem to be looking at ritual threaded through the fabric of everyday space. One way to think about this is in terms of how people move their bodies. Verticality matters. Climbing the steps inside the tower or ascending a built-up platform in a house changes your point of view. You rise above the usual sightlines of walls and hearths. In many cultures, up is associated with power, with sky, with beings that oversee. A person standing on a raised place, speaking or performing, is not just physically higher. Their words carry a different weight. Enclosure matters too. The tower's interior stairwell is narrow, spiralling, closing you in as you go. Certain rooms at Jericho are windowless, thick-walled, accessed through low doorways that require you to stoop. Crossing into them is a small bodily transformation, from standing upright in open courtyards to bending, entering, and finding yourself in a contained, demarcated space. And then there are thresholds, the moments when you step from one kind of space into another, through a door lintel darkened by many hands, across a band of differently coloured plaster, over a buried skull. Across cultures and times, these three elements, height, enclosure and threshold, often mark out places where ordinary rules stretch or bend. You go up to proclaim or to watch. You go in to meet, to swear, to mourn. You pause at the threshold to gather yourself, to change your footing before you change your role. It is not difficult to imagine the Jericho Tower working this way. No incense burners or carved idols have survived to tell us that formal ceremonies took place there, but its very form is suggestive. A prominent cylinder of stone anchored to the settlement wall, with a staircase hidden inside. If you wanted a place where many eyes could turn toward a single figure, or where a group could gather to mark a moment in the seasonal cycle, you would not need anything more elaborate. Perhaps at harvest time people climbed the interior steps and emerged at the top to survey the fields, announcing the first cutting of grain. Perhaps at the turning of the year, a small group watched the sunrise from the tower's rim, checking where it rose against the distant hills, using the landscape itself as a kind of calendar. Perhaps elders, who also tended the plastered ancestors under their floors, met there to settle disputes that touched more than one household. The point is not that we can reconstruct the script in detail, but that the architecture offers a potential stage. Ritual does not require statues or written liturgies to leave traces. It can be encoded in repeated pathways, in spaces that require certain postures, in the thickening of plaster where many feet have turned and paused. A doorway that everyone smooths with their hand when they pass becomes, over time, an object of quiet attention whether or not anyone names it holy. Archaeologists, however, are wary of letting this kind of imaginative reading run too far. Labeling a feature ritual can become a way of saying, we don't really know what this was for. To avoid that, researchers look for clusters of evidence, unusual architecture, repeated patterns of deposition, specific objects placed, broken, or buried in similar ways. Signs of restricted access, like blocked doorways or deliberately closed floors, where traces that suggest standing, watching, gathering, rather than cooking, sleeping, or crafting. At Jericho we have some of these hints. Intensively renewed floors that suggest frequent use by many people, platforms and benches that could accommodate seated groups, the dramatic conjunction of tower and wall, whose construction would have required coordination beyond the household level. What we lack, compared to later periods, are explicit markers, altars, inscriptions, figurines placed in clearly delimited shrines. So interpretation sits on a spectrum. At one end are those who see Jericho's tower and special rooms as primarily practical, defense, storage, circulation, with any ritual dimension as secondary, layered on by people using convenient spaces for gatherings when needed. At the other end are those who think the community may have built them first and foremost as focal points for shared rites, with practical uses added later or simply folded into the same structures. What both sides tend to agree on is that ritual life at Jericho was not something isolated from daily work. It was a way of patterning that work and giving it meaning at a time when everything else was in motion. Climate stabilizing after the Younger Dryas, wild plants edging toward cultivation, mobile foragers settling into more permanent communities around reliable water sources like Jericho's spring. In such a context, coming together, climbing the same steps, sitting on the same benches, crossing the same thresholds in a particular order, would have been part of how we was defined. Which faces were plastered and buried under which floors? Who had the right to stand on the tower? Who was invited into certain rooms when decisions were made or stories told? Ritual, then, was not just about pleasing unseen powers. It was about making a new kind of community feel real, turning an experimental way of life, stone houses, grain stores, shared walls, into something more than a temporary camp. And the architecture that held these people was both workshop and script, giving shape to actions that, repeated year after year, slowly taught everyone what it meant to belong in a place called Jericho, even before anyone built what we would comfortably name a temple. About 1,000 kilometers to the northwest of Jericho, on a low rise in southeastern Turkey, another group of early villagers, or perhaps not quite villagers, was doing something that would later unsettle the entire story of how monuments begin. Göbekli Tepe sits on a limestone ridge above the plains, looking out over seasonal streams and grazing lands. It is also early. The deepest enclosures, with their great T-shaped pillars, belong to the 10th millennium BCE, overlapping in time with the earliest pre-pottery Neolithic levels at Jericho. When archaeologists first realized how old it was, it forced a pause. Monumental stone architecture had long been associated with settled farming societies, with full-time villages or emerging towns. Yet here were massive carved pillars, some over 5 meters tall, standing in circular enclosures, built by communities who seem still to have been, at least in part, mobile hunter-gatherers. For decades, the working assumption had been that agriculture came first, monuments later. You get fields and surplus, then specialists and leaders, and only then do you see people rearranging tons of stone for meaning. Göbekli Tepe cracked that neat sequence. It suggested that coordinated labour and large shared structures might appear, while cultivation was still tentative, ownership blurry, and daily life not yet anchored to permanent streets and courtyards. Placed side by side, Jericho and Göbekli Tepe look like cousins in this early experiment with scale. Both are older than most of the familiar milestones. No pottery, no metal, no writing. Yet in both places people organize themselves to move and stack heavy stones in deliberate patterns. At Jericho, the tower and its adjoining wall. At Göbekli Tepe, rings of pillars linked by stone walls, with central monoliths rising like abstracted human figures. Both sites show evidence of planning that goes beyond one household. At Jericho, levelling the ground, cutting the tower stair, and tying it all into a stone perimeter required more labour and coordination than a family could supply on its own. At Göbekli Tepe, quarrying, shaping, transporting and erecting multi-ton pillars demanded crews, knowledge of leverage, and some way of persuading many hands to show up at the same time. In both places, symbolism bleeds into structure. Jericho's tower exerts its meaning largely through form and placement. A solid cylinder plugged into the wall at a carefully chosen point in the landscape. A spiral of steps hidden inside. Verticality and enclosure doing their quiet work on bodies and imaginations. Göbekli Tepe's symbolism is more explicit. The pillars carry reliefs of animals, foxes, snakes, boars, birds, and abstract signs. The T-shapes themselves are widely interpreted as stylized human forms, with hands and belts carved on some of the central monoliths. Here, the architecture itself is anthropomorphized, as if people had stepped into a ring made of stone beings. Yet when you look closely, differences emerge that matter just as much as the echoes. Jericho, even in its earliest Neolithic phases, is a settlement in the straightforward sense. There are domestic structures, storage spaces, hearths. People slept, cooked, stored grain, tended their dead. The tower is inserted into this dense fabric of daily life. You walk past it as you fetch water or sweep a courtyard. Whatever gatherings it hosted, it shared its horizon with ovens, grinding stones and children underfoot. Göbekli Tepe, in its monumental phases, looks more like a special-purpose hill. So far, excavators have found no clear domestic architecture of the usual kind. No clusters of small houses packed around the enclosures. Instead, the hill seems to have been a place where people came together seasonally or periodically, built and rebuilt ritual spaces, feasted, perhaps brokered alliances, and then dispersed back into a wider landscape. Lithic studies and faunal remains suggest surrounding groups were still heavily reliant on hunting wild animals, with cultivation, if present, at a very early stage. The architecture types underscore this contrast. Jericho's buildings are mostly modest rectangles and earlier round houses, practical, subdivided, adaptable. The tower and wall use unshaped or roughly shaped stones, their power arising from mass and placement rather than carved detail. Göbekli Tepe's enclosures are deliberately non-domestic, circular or oval spaces with inward-facing pillars, the walls low enough that the pillars dominate. The stones themselves are carefully extracted and carved, turning practical engineering into a gallery of images. These are not places optimized for sleeping or storing grain. They are stages, containers for gatherings framed explicitly in symbolic stone. Even the way the ground is treated differs. Jericho builds up a tell, layer upon layer of occupation. Houses are rebuilt on the same spots, floors are renewed, ancestors are buried beneath and within. The settlement thickens vertically over centuries, its meaning accumulating in the repetition of dwelling. At Göbekli Tepe, the people who used the site eventually buried their own enclosures deliberately, filling them with rubble and earth before building new ones nearby or on top. The hill grows not through continuous living, but through episodes of construction and closure, each monumental space having a life cycle that ends with intentional concealment. These contrasts make it tempting to tell a tidy story. Mobile ritual center first, then settled ritual embedded in a village, then later cities with formal temples. But the archaeological record does not support a single staircase of development where one site evolves into the other. Jericho and Göbekli Tepe are broadly contemporary. They occupy different ecological niches, draw on different subsistence mixes, and express collective effort in different architectural languages. Rather than earlier and later in a moral sense, primitive to advanced, it may be more accurate to see them as parallel experiments in how far small human groups can push coordination, symbolism, and placemaking before anything like a state exists. What they jointly demonstrate is that big building does not wait patiently for cities, kings, or bureaucracies. You do not need palaces, taxes, or standing armies to quarry and stack stone on a monumental scale. You need shared stories, trusted organizers, and reasons strong enough, fear, hope, obligation, excitement, to make hundreds of people align their bodies in the same task. At Jericho, those reasons were woven into a settlement that tried to hold water, food, and memory in one concentrated point on the landscape. At Göbekli Tepe, they seem to have been tied to a gathering place that stood apart from where most people slept. A hill turned into a meeting ground for scattered groups. Both sites remind us that the roots of monumentality lie not only in hierarchy, but in the human capacity to imagine a structure that will outlast a single season, and then to persuade others to help make that imagination solid. If we move forward a couple of thousand years, and a few hundred kilometers to the northwest of Jericho, another settlement enters the story, Çatalhöyük. By the time Çatalhöyük is thriving, in the 7th millennium BCE, the world has shifted again. Pottery has appeared in many regions, farming is more established, herding of sheep and goats is widespread. Jericho's earliest tower and wall belong to the pre-pottery Neolithic. Çatalhöyük stands in the era when clay is being fired into vessels and even into small figurines. Çatalhöyük is famous for its density. From the excavated areas, it seems to be a continuous honeycomb of mud brick rooms, built wall to wall without streets in between. People likely moved across flat roofs, entering their homes by ladders from above. Interior spaces are packed with platforms, hearths, storage bins, wall paintings, niches, installations, burials beneath floors. Many houses show similar layouts, but with particular ornaments, paintings, or arrangements that make each household distinct. It is tempting to imagine Çatalhöyük as a kind of proto-city, a bustling maze of neighbours pressed close, each house a microcosm of social life and ritual. But archaeologists are careful here. Population estimates vary. Debates continue about how many of the visible rooms were occupied at once, how long each cluster was used, how social groups were organised. The site gives an impression of density and complexity, yet the scale of decision-making, whether it was neighbourhood level, lineage-based, or something more centralised, remains a matter of interpretation. What seems reasonably clear is that at Çatalhöyük, the household is a primary unit of meaning. Ritual appears to be embedded directly into domestic space. Bull's horns fixed to walls and platforms, painted panels with geometric and animal motifs, burials of community members beneath house floors, sometimes accompanied by plastered skulls or other modifications. The same spaces where people cooked, slept, and worked were also the spaces where they remembered ancestors and enacted symbolic practices. When you set this beside Jericho, an interesting contrast emerges. Jericho, in its early Neolithic phases, certainly had meaningful houses, and, as we've seen, its own practices of skull removal and plastering, but its most conspicuous architectural emphasis is not within any single dwelling. It is the wall and the tower, features that cut across households, that define a shared perimeter and a shared vertical landmark. At Jericho, whatever decisions led to piling up stone in a ring and raising a massive cylinder from its base, those choices had to involve coordination above the family level. The wall sets an inside and an outside. The tower draws the eye, the feet, the imagination toward a specific spot. It is a collective statement embedded in the village fabric. At Çatalhöyük, by contrast, the power seems to diffuse horizontally through a swarm of houses. There are no freestanding towers or encircling stone walls of the Jericho kind. Instead, each household is thick with meaning. The cumulative effect of hundreds of such houses produces something monumental in a different sense. Not a single dominating structure, but an extended landscape of ritualized dwelling. In one place, a towering focus that gathers people physically around a shared vertical axis. In the other, a mat of interconnected domestic cells where meaning is folded into every platform and wall. Neither pattern is more advanced in any simple way. They are different solutions to the same deep question. How do you hold a growing community together, store its memories, and organize its labor without kings, temples, or writing? And of course, these two are not alone. Across the broader region of Southwest Asia, early farming and village life take many forms. Sites like Ain Ghazal in Jordan, with its own traditions of plastered statues and large communal structures. Abu Huraira on the Euphrates, showing a long shift from foraging to cultivation and then to herding. The spread of small villages across the Levantine corridor, the upper Tigris and Euphrates, and the Anatolian plateau, each with its particular mix of architecture, subsistence, and ritual. Some communities invest heavily in enclosing walls. Others emphasize special interior rooms. Some build platform mounds. Some appear modest on the surface, but hide rich symbolic worlds in burials and small objects. The path toward what we call complexity is not a single paved road. It is a braided river with many channels, some of which dry up while others deepen. This raises a question. What do archaeologists actually mean when they talk about complex societies? It is easy to slide into a shorthand where complexity equals cities, kings, palaces, and writing. But many researchers use the term more broadly. Complexity can refer to the number of different roles people play, the variety of economic activities, the presence of long-distance exchange networks, the ways authority is distributed or contested. It can show up in how space is organized, in the diversity of buildings, in how communities manage surplus, in the sophistication of their ritual landscapes. A village where every house is a near copy of every other, food is shared relatively evenly, and decision-making is highly local might be called simple in this technical sense. A community of similar population size but with clear specialization. Some people mainly herding, others crafting obsidian blades, others coordinating seasonal rituals, might be called more complex, even if it has no monumental temples and no kings. From this perspective, Jericho's tower is not important because it proves that a city or a state already existed. It is important because it suggests that, even in a pre-pottery Neolithic community, people were already experimenting with ways to materialize collective concerns in stone. The tower hints at coordination across households, at shared narratives about danger, ancestors, cosmos, or all of these at once. It points to some mechanism, councils, elders, seasonal gatherings, charismatic individuals, that could mobilize many hands for a task whose benefits and meanings were not confined to a single family courtyard. It challenges the tidy timelines where step 1 is small egalitarian camps, step 2 is slightly larger villages, and only much later do we see anything like public architecture. Here, in the shadow of the receding Younger Dryas, long before clay tablets or dynastic lists, a community at Tel es Sultan has already sunk enormous effort into a structure that is simultaneously practical and symbolic, defensive and performative, everyday and extraordinary. As we follow these early experiments, it is worth pausing for a moment. If you find yourself wanting to explore more of these deep, slow stories, The channel's book goes into them at length. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there is a small discount for listeners who feel like bringing a longer version of these nightside journeys to the bedside table. Returning to Jericho and its companions, the broader picture that emerges is not of a single ladder from primitive to civilized, but of many paths, crossing and recrossing. Göbekli Tepe shows that large ritual enclosures can precede domestic streets. Çatalhöyük shows that intensely ritualized houses can aggregate into something that feels city-like, without clear temples or palaces. Jericho shows that defensive-looking walls and a massive tower can appear, while people still lack pottery and metal, while their lives are grounded in mud brick, stone, grain and water. Each site complicates the idea that you can draw a clean line on a timeline and say, here, below this point, no real monuments. Above this point, civilization begins. Jericho's tower especially pushes back against that simplicity. It stands there, 11,000 years old, in a settlement without writing, without kings, without the state machinery we often assume is necessary for large building projects. It asks us to consider that humans were capable of sophisticated coordination, planning, and symbolic architecture much earlier than older narratives allowed. In doing so, it does not give us a new single story. It invites us to accept that early human communities, from Jericho to Çatalhöyük and beyond, were already exploring many different ways to be complex. If all of this feels a bit tangled, part of the reason is that Jericho itself is tangled. Archaeologists are not all staring at the same clear photograph and arguing about what it shows. They're dealing with fragments, with different kinds of evidence that each tell a slightly different story. Start with the environment. From cores taken in nearby lakes and marshes, from pollen grains trapped in ancient sediments, we can reconstruct something of the landscape around early Jericho. These environmental records point to a world where the end of the Younger Dryas brought somewhat more reliable warmth and moisture, but still with fluctuations. Grasslands and shrubs, stands of wild cereals, a dependable spring at the base of the mound. To some scholars, this looks like a place where people might worry more about floods, erosion, and managing water than about human enemies. The wadi above the site could send sudden torrents down in heavy rains. A stone wall and a massive tower rooted against the slope might then be read as part of a system to stabilize the mound, protect terraces, or channel runoff, but the architecture itself tells another tale. When you stand in the excavated trench and look at the thickness of the stone wall, the way it encircles the lower part of the settlement, the sheer volume of rock hauled and fitted, it is easy to see why early excavators called it fortification. In many later periods, walls like that are built to keep people out. Even if there is no clear evidence yet of large-scale warfare at this date, the built form has a defensive logic. A ring that defines an inside and an outside, a tower that could serve as a watch point, perhaps as a last refuge if something threatening approached across the plain. Meanwhile, the bioarchaeological data, the evidence from bones, seeds, and human remains, add still more layers. Plant remains suggest a mixed economy of gathering, early cultivation, and perhaps storage. Animal bones show hunting of wild gazelle and other species, gradually shifting toward more managed herds. Human skeletons record patterns of diet and labor. Stress lines in teeth, healed fractures, muscle attachment marks from repetitive work. Some researchers read these patterns as the signature of a community working hard to make a living in a marginal environment, pooling labor to build shared structures that help manage risk, against flood, against animal predators, against the uncertainties of early cultivation. Others see in the same bones hints of social differentiation. Some burials appear more elaborately treated than others. The curated skulls and plastered faces suggest that certain individuals, certain lineages, might have carried special weight in decisions. Perhaps the tower and wall were also about marking status, anchoring ceremonies that reinforced a hierarchy within the group. Different data sets, different emphases, different stories. On top of this comes a more basic problem: time. Dating deep prehistory is always a matter of probabilities rather than exactness. Radiocarbon ages come with error margins. The earliest tower at Jericho belongs to a broad slice of the pre-pottery Neolithic A, but pinning it to a specific decade or even a single century is difficult. Later building phases cut into earlier ones. Erosion removes some layers. Earlier excavations before modern recording standards disturbed others. When a wall has been repaired and rebuilt over centuries, it can be hard to tell which stones belong to the first design and which to later modifications. The tower staircase may not always have looked the same. Entrances may have shifted. Connections between domestic houses and the tower base could have changed as the settlement grew. Archaeologists are, in effect, trying to reconstruct a long, slow movie from a few surviving frames, some of them blurred. Out of this partial record, several clusters of hypotheses have emerged. In one cluster, the wall and tower are primarily defensive. They are early fortifications against raids, against intergroup conflict as territories and resources become more tightly bounded in the Neolithic. The tower is a lookout, the wall is a barrier. Ritual meanings are secondary, perhaps added later. In another cluster, the explanation is more practical. The wall helps retain the mound, protects against erosion, or channels seasonal floods. The tower might be part of a terracing system, a stair to move between levels, or a monumental marker associated with water management. Any defensive use is occasional and opportunistic. A third cluster emphasizes ceremony. The tower is a ritual focus, a place for processions, for watching the heavens, for dramatizing seasonal rites tied to planting and harvest. The wall, in this view, marks sacred space as much as domestic space, turning the whole settlement into a kind of low sanctuary. Practical functions exist, but the primary engine is symbolic. And then there are social readings. Here, the tower and wall are seen as tools for building community itself. By requiring massive collective labour, they create obligations, shared memories, and perhaps opportunities for certain individuals or families to direct and display leadership. The structures need not be primarily about enemies, floods, or even gods. They can be about the social fabric, about making a we that is big enough to maintain a large village without formal kings. Most scholars do not choose a single explanation and discard all others. Instead, they weight the possibilities differently. One might argue that defense and water management are roughly equal drivers, with ritual built on top. Another might see ritual and social cohesion as leading, with practicality following. The disagreements are often about emphasis and likelihood, not about mutually exclusive certainties. Underneath these debates lies an important habit of mind, methodological humility. In a site as old and as complex as Tel es-Sultan, there are hard limits on what we can know. Archaeologists work with inference and probability. They test ideas against new data. They compare Jericho with other pre-pottery Neolithic sites, with Göbekli Tepe's enclosures, with Ain Gazal's statues, with Çatalhöyük's packed houses, to see what patterns repeat and what remains unique. Conclusions are always provisional. A new radiocarbon series, a newly opened trench, a refined understanding of regional climate can shift the balance of arguments. The tower that looks like a fortification in one interpretive climate may lean more towards ceremony in another as comparative cases accumulate. Yet within this uncertainty, some things about Jericho stand out with relative clarity. Whatever the precise mix of motives, building the tower and wall required planning that extended beyond a single season. Stones had to be quarried, moved, shaped, and fitted. The staircase had to spiral at a workable angle. the wall had to follow a coherent line around the settlement's edge. Someone or some group thought this through. The community remembered these decisions over generations. They repaired, modified, and sometimes rebuilt. The idea of living behind a stone boundary and in the shadow of a towering structure became part of what it meant to be from this place. And all of this depended on cooperation. Whether power was fairly flat or already somewhat stratified, hundreds of people had to align their effort, hauling rock, mixing mud, maintaining foundations, climbing stairs whose purpose they may have debated just as we do now. This, perhaps, is Jericho's most reliable message. Even when the details blur, the tower and wall show that 11,000 years ago, a community at the edge of the desert could imagine a shared project large enough to reshape their landscape, long-lasting enough to tie generations together, and flexible enough in meaning that it could be practical, defensive, ceremonial, and social all at once. It reminds us that our reconstructions of the past are always drafts, but that the human capacities they reveal, planning, memory, and cooperation, are as solid as the stone still standing in the tell. When we step back from the trench, from the arguments about flood control versus fortification versus ritual, a few things at Jericho come into focus with more confidence than others. One is that there is no single switch we can point to and say, here, civilization turns on. What we see instead are many threads weaving together at different times and in different places. At Jericho it is permanent houses, shared labour, early crops, water management, remembered ancestors, and a stone tower that ties sky, slope, and settlement into one continuous line. In other regions, at roughly similar dates, the mix is different. At Göbekli Tepe we see spectacular ritual architecture without clear evidence for everyday village life. At Çatalhöyük, centuries later, we see dense domestic clustering, shared roofs, wall paintings, and burials under floors, but no single dominating tower. Each case reminds us that what we often call the birth of civilization is really a patchwork of experiments. Sedentary life can precede pottery. Monumentality can come before writing. Ritual, farming, trade, and inequality can each arrive on their own timetables, overlap, retreat, and reappear. Jericho's tower quietly challenges another habit as well, the tendency to underestimate anything that happened before texts and kings. When we expect clay tablets, palaces, and named rulers as the minimum markers of complexity, 11,000-year-old stonework can look primitive by comparison. But if we pause and trace the staircase in our minds, if we imagine the coordination needed to build and maintain a wall around an oasis, the distance between prehistory and history grows much thinner. There is politics here, even if we cannot name the leaders. There's engineering, even if we cannot read the plans. There is meaning, even if no one carved it into stone. In the end, perhaps the most honest answer to what the tower was for is that it was for them, for the people who chose and kept choosing to live at this spring, for the generations who decided that their landscape should include a human-made cliff of fitted stone, a spiral path upward, and a line of boundary between inside and out. If you close your eyes now, you might picture it. The dark bulk of the mound against a pale sky, the curved wall holding the slope, the tower rising where rock meets earth, the spring murmuring nearby, low houses clustered inside, children running up and down the stairs until the elders call them back, a community's long decision, set in stone. If you've enjoyed wandering through this older-than-cities world, you might like to explore more of these prehistoric secrets in the book I've put together. You can learn more or find a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. If this helped you drift towards sleep, or kept your curiosity company for a while, you can gently tap like and subscribe so you don't miss future journeys into the deep past. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. what you think the tower meant, and where in the world you're listening from tonight. For now, we leave the oasis to its own quiet, and let the tower keep its patient watch a little longer,